Welcome to another edition of Begley's Mailbag, where we answer your questions on the Knicks and the NBA. We'll get started here with Kivy015, who asks, has Immanuel Quickley's play recently changed the front office's plans to get a point guard in the offseason? Now, I don't have any recent information, meaning in the past week, on this, so I don't want to mislead anyone, but I do know that, and we mentioned this on the putback this week, that around the trade deadline thereafter, there was talk about Jalen Brunson and adding him and what that might mean internally. And one of their elements there was, if you add a player like Brunson, then you have Quickley, Rose, and Brunson in your backcourt, all undersized. And that was something that was brought up as potentially, an issue. And I don't know where the Knicks landed there, but I know it was kind of bandied about internally. So that's one thing to keep an eye on with Quickley. But again, this is before Quickley's recent surge, and he's played very well recently for this Knick club. If I had to guess, I would guess that the Knicks still went after a point guard and still allowed Quickley maybe time to develop into a potential of running a team full time. I don't know if they think he's there yet, but that being said, his recent play, you can't deny how good he's been of late, and that bodes well for him and the Knicks because he's dealt with adversity, struggles early on in this year, and he's come out on top of it. That's a great sign. And we've got one from Camille888 who asks, hypothetical water gun to your head. Do you see Mitchell Robinson signing an extension before he were to hit unrestricted free agency? My best guess here is the idea that it hadn't been done prior to the trade deadline or right after the trade deadline leads me to believe that Mitchell Robinson will enter unrestricted free agency. And I think that, once you get there, it's kind of all bets are off because the team could come in with a big offer that the Knicks decide not to match. But I think that when you talk about the talks to this point, I know that going back to the All-Star break trade deadline, that point in February, the sides had been far apart on what Robinson's side was looking for in an extension and what the Knicks were talking about in an extension. Is it possible that the Knicks come up and make an offer that Robinson decides to take? Yes, it's possible, but I would think at this point, he has decided to go test the open market and see what he can get. There's going to be significant interest for Robinson. Several teams had expressed interest around the trade deadline, including the Pistons, who subsequently acquired Marvin Begley. So I don't know how that impacts their interest in Robinson, but I'm sure there's going to be multiple teams interested in him. So I would think that he tests the market. And then if you're the Knicks, the decision is, do you match a team's offer? Do you not? And if they don't execute a sign and trade, if they decide to let Robinson walk, to me, that's a pretty bad mismanagement of an asset because you're letting a player who you've groomed for the past 4 years in your program walk away for nothing. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. We've got a big one from 917 Zach, who asks, is there a chance the Knicks explore avenues for a Julius Randle trade this summer, or is his value so low to the point where it wouldn't make sense? Well, a couple of things here. I do know that before the trade deadline, several teams had interest in acquiring Randle. The idea of kind of playing him in a different role than the Knicks had been playing him in, but they saw value there. They saw a player that could help you win. And so I say that to kind of set up what may happen in the offseason. Now, if you're the Knicks, I don't think you're turning your phone off with regards to teams calling you about potential trades, including Julius Randle. And I think if the idea is to upgrade the roster via trade because you don't have a lot of flexibility in free agency, then if you're going to acquire a big-time player, you have to move somebody like Julius Randle to do that. With regards to his trade value, I do think that when those teams had interest in Randle, thinking about putting him in a different role, that tells you that at the very least, teams saw Randle as a player who could help them. So that tells you a little bit about his trade value. His contract, again, 5-year extension. But when you look at the number and you compare it to where the CBA may go next, Randle's number in the mid-20s is not onerous. It's not going to be onerous. It's going to actually look maybe more team-friendly if the new CBA jumps up the way we expect it to. So, I don't think his trade value is as low as you might perceive. Obviously, he struggled this season. The Knicks have struggled this season for a million different reasons, but Randle's play is front and center there. But I don't think that his value is so low to the point where the Knicks would hold on to him with the hope of his trade value increasing. We've got one from Presidente, who I think you should give a follow on Twitter. Very insightful about the Knicks and basketball in general. And Presidente asks, what are your thoughts or the front office's thoughts on trading back or trading out of the draft? My thoughts, I'm impartial. It doesn't bother me one way or the other. But in terms of the front office's thoughts, I could just go based on what we've seen so far from this front office, right? And we've seen them make trades on draft day, but we haven't seen them fully trade out of the draft. We've seen them use their picks in creative ways to move up, down, back in the draft, but they've always made a pick. So I would assume that barring something crazy where the Knicks maybe go after, a star player like a Lillard or a Donovan Mitchell, one of those players who maybe becomes disgruntled, Karl Anthony Towns, barring that pick being used in a trade like that, I would assume the Knicks make the pick because, if you're talking about doing a sign and trade with Jalen Brunson, I would think that you've got young players who you can move to make that trade work where you don't have to include this draft pick. But I think a trade for a player at the next tier, like a Towns or players we mentioned before, I would assume that the team would really want to get that first round pick from the Knicks and they'd be open to moving it. But I don't think it would happen, in a lesser trade. But I think we'll hear more about that in the coming weeks as we get closer to this draft. We've got one from CD Nugget 13 who wants to know, do the Knicks want to keep or extend Cam Reddish? Based on everything I know, they absolutely want to keep him. The front office wants to see what Reddish can do when healthy. And I was talking to Trae Young's father a couple weeks ago just about the atmosphere at the Garden last year in the Hawks-Knicks playoff series. And I asked him about Cam Reddish. And Trae Young's dad, just so you know, heck of a player in his own right, was a star at Texas Tech, so he knows the game very well. And he said, Reddish, when he's healthy, if he's healthy, has the potential to be a really high-end player. He said, he remembers Trae Young coming back from workouts telling him, hey, Dad, Cam Reddish can play. This guy can really play. So the talent is there for Cam Reddish. It's about staying healthy over an extended period of time and staying on the court. And so maybe this full offseason will help Reddish, prepare himself properly for the next season. In regards to extending Reddish, I wouldn't expect it to happen this offseason, but I do know that, teams that were kind of monitoring the Reddish situation back when he was in Atlanta were under the impression that the market for Reddish and what Reddish would want would have been somewhere around, $18 million a year in an extension. So that's just something to keep in mind here with Reddish moving forward. I don't think the extension happens this offseason, but if you're the Knicks, I would assume that you're comfortable going to that number when you trade for him because you have the same knowledge as the other teams that were kind of monitoring that Reddish situation prior to his trade to the Knicks. That's it for this edition of the Mailbag. Please keep those questions on the Knicks and the NBA coming. We love answering them. We'll have another edition of the Mailbag later this month.